Hello, we're live. So,
Yeah, hello everyone.
hello
Hi
everyone.
guys.
We're live. Sevi, can you begin with a round of intros, and I'm gonna uh,
Sure. Hi
explain how we're gonna
everyone.
do it today. Sorry.
Welcome. Thank you. Welcome to the second part of our Google's web rendering service webinar. This is Sevi from Only, and thanks for tuning in. Okay, last week we had the first part of our webinar with the amazing Martin Shiplet from Google, and he did his best, as always, to respond to our findings and answer to some of the questions from you guys. But with Martin, we didn't have much time, so today we have more time to dive deep into all the findings from our research that's been going on for, I think, over a year now. Today, we are together with our CEO, Bartosz. Hi, Bartosz. How are you?
Hello. Hey, Sevi, I'm good. Thank you.
Super. And the head of our R&D department, Tomek Ruczki. Hi, Tomek. Welcome.
Hi, welcome.
Hi. And with me together, I'm the SEO specialist at Onely. Okay, so Tomek and Bartosz will share some great and very insightful tips and tricks today, and some very key important points from the findings. And if you have any questions, please write them in the comment sections, and we'll take as much time as we can to answer them all. So today we have more like a laid back format, so we don't have much time limit, so we'll do our best and it's gonna be cool. Thank you very much. Now I'm handing it over to you, Bartosz.
Thank you so much, Sevi. Thanks so much for the intro, and thanks so much, Sevi, for such a nice introduction. So, as Sevi mentioned, today we're basically in a quite a both laid back format, but at the same time we're gonna be geeking out quite a bit. But the goal is to make it extremely accessible for you. So ask questions. We'll pause. We'll stop. We'll go through every single example or a case study that we're going through, and we'll answer that or clarify all of the doubts. At the same time, as we're gonna do a lot of things live, hopefully for you guys, because it's always the most important part, something will fail. So so please forgive us. Hopefully everything is gonna work, but we have a lot of things where basically we go off the presentation and we're gonna go through to the real world. Let's call it that. Okay, so without any further ado. I'm just looking at the chat if you guys are there. Thank you so much. I see we have Barry Adams here, we have Joran, we have quite a lot of people. Amazing. So without all these long intros, let's get moving. So today we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into Google's web rendering service. And by that, let's split that into a few elements. It's gonna be crawling, rendering, indexing, and partial indexing. So we're gonna dive into these parts and how those three elements kind of play together. Moving forward, the problem is right now in 2020 that we still don't know the most important part that was a problem of JavaScript SEO in the part. Now it's a part of rendering SEO and more of a indexing problem. We don't know if you have a JS-powered website or even an HTML website, if you're gonna get indexed. And this is actually quite interesting because right now you are most likely on the JavaScript powered website. So 1, 2, 3 years ago, we still struggled with that term. But now if we look even at WordPress websites, they will have elements or parts of their content relying on JavaScript or rendering to show up. So the problem is that with that, in the very beginning, Google didn't really give us that much info. It changed last week with Martin Split joining our webinar and addressing all that new research. And today we want to dive a little bit deeper into that topic. So let me begin with a tiny bit of how this all started, which is quite interesting actually. We've built a toolset last year. And this happened after a year of two or even more of trying to understand why Google is indexing and rendering some elements at that time were only focused on JavaScript and why some other elements are not indexed properly. And we've built this tool called the Google Indexing Forecast, TGIF, that was tracking how content is indexed throughout time. So basically, if you publish your content today, it's going to be indexed within 24 hours, maybe 2 weeks, maybe never. And findings from that were quite interesting because by a total accident, we also added HTML content. We assumed that URLs will be indexed without any delay, or maybe for some edge cases, some websites will struggle with indexing HTML. We had to do that to basically track JavaScript indexing properly, and this led to all this new research after we saw all the data. So we got a list of the most popular e-commerce stores and newspapers and publishers, like all the popular huge websites that most of us visit quite often. So we looked at the traffic, at the volume, at the top 500 companies and so on. And for all of these, we started checking their sitemaps for all the new URLs. And obviously we checked if the new URL is indexable. If it is, we would add it to our system. And if we see that URL has a no index tag or whatever, or is blocked in robots, we would ignore that. So only all of the URLs within our database are only the ones that websites actually push into the index as new indexable URLs. So with that in mind, we started also checking fragments of content, because again, with partial indexing, some of the content is indexed and some of the content is not indexed properly. So we started manually tagging different sections of the layout to see if those get indexed at the same time. And this led to all these interesting findings. Because if we look at that, the first thing we check if the URL by itself is indexed in Google. We also have like some fallback mechanism, because Google is not really making that easy on anyone right now to scrape. So the site command comes with a lot of problems. We'll get into that in a second. So then we check if a fragment of the content from that page is indexed, again using that site command, and that's going to give us a little bit more insights. And with the site command, we have a lot of new challenges. There are some ways around that, but just make sure to play with that, to have some kind of fallback when you check your indexing stats, because Google is very, very often is going to give you a lot of false negatives. So make sure that you don't take this with just one try. You need a couple different tricks. So make sure to use an element of the content from the website or anything, just to be extremely sure that this is not in Google's index. So the outcome of...
before the outcome, can I stop you here?
Sure.
Because I had myself this question, and I was in contact with some people from the industry. They were also very curious about how we actually, excuse me, acquire this amazing set of data. So you just explained that we get only indexable URLs, right? That is the very crucial point, I think. So the URLs that are, for example, canonicalized, blocked by robots.txt, or no index or something, they don't go into our research, right? Only indexable URLs. And one more question: how often do we follow these URLs?
So every single time that that's a very good question, because we check the first check of the URL is within 24 hours. So we fetch that URL, we check if it's indexable, and we check if it's indexed within 24 hours. With every interval, so it's 24 hours, 7 days, and 14 days. During every single check or interval, so those 3 times we check those URLs, obviously there is fallback, so it's more than 3 times, but during these 3 intervals, we check every single time if the content is still available, if it doesn't redirect. A lot of times, and this is going to happen very, very often, that the URL or the product, for example, is going to get out of stock, and they will get a soft 404. So we try to remove these as well. And you would be surprised how messy those sitemaps are. So first of all, they are still serving those low quality, let's call it that, URLs to Google, but we have quite a lot of mechanisms, and that's why we have to add every single website manually. Quite a lot of mechanism to check if this URL is still okay after 7 days and after 2 weeks. So those things that we check for, first of all, is it still indexable after 7 days and after 14 days? Is that fragment of content? So if we're checking, for example, for people who bought this also bought as a fragment, is it still within the page? For some pages, when the product is not in stock, this section disappears, so that would give us a false negative. So I don't want to go into details too much, but we have the same checks that we do with the first fetch of that sitemap. we repeat with every interval.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so moving forward. So the outcome of all that checking of all these all this research, and have in mind that when we built that last year, it was about JavaScript SEO. Some of the things, I hear that Barry Adams is waiting for us to prove that JavaScript isn't evil. I don't think I have the power of that, Barry. I will just show you that JavaScript is not as important anymore as it was. So now we need to expand the evil theory to HTML as well, but we'll get into that in a second. So first of all, now we know that there is a massive indexing delay. And I remember, I think it was John Meller saying that, I'm not 100% sure, maybe Tomek is gonna correct me, that if a URL is not indexed after a month, most likely Google is not gonna pick it up at all. That's why we chose the 14 days interval, because it doesn't really change that much later on. But still, the 14 days is quite interesting if we look at how many URLs are not indexed after 2 weeks. And we have that database. So why am I saying that? Today we're going to dive into a lot of interesting finding from that very database. Because first of all, these statistics, they fluctuate quite a bit. So for example, the last update from May, if you see that on the screen here, it changed quite a lot. It changed how Google is indexing JavaScript content, but also it affected quite a bit how Google is indexing HTML. So we have different delays, we have different statistics now, because one of the Google updates changed how Google is rendering and indexing content. And again, we have different statements from Google, as this one from Martin, where he said that they have 5 seconds median to render, and that's okay. I believe that this is true, that they render most of the content within 5 seconds, but it doesn't mean that this is indexed. So we need to understand that crawling, rendering and indexing, every single step here may change if we're gonna get indexed. So again, we have thousands of big brands out of Google Index, and let me show you some of the very, very cool examples. First of all, there are huge brands like Walmart, like UX, that are barely in Google's index. So this is extremely interesting because they're focusing on all these SEO, I'm hoping, strategies and all these SEO activities, but they're not indexed, so it actually doesn't matter that much. Indexing HTML is actually quite difficult, and there are a lot of challenges with just HTML websites. And this was one of the most eye-opening thing for me, because HTML seems to be, and that's partially answering Barry's question, this presentation is not going to be about JavaScript mostly. It's going to be about Google's challenges with layout and HTML, which seems to be a problem, because Google now is very, very good with JavaScript, but we see that the problem is much bigger than just JavaScript moving forward. Indexing trends fluctuate, and those trends, if we want to understand some of the Google updates and we try to say, okay, this is about ads, this is about links and quality, but we see that, for example, some websites, they're not indexed like 70-80% after a Google update, we need to start looking into that as well, because your traffic may decline quite a bit because your content is removed from Google completely. So you may change that content as much as you like, you may improve that, but again, it's not indexed, and Google is not crawling and indexing that. So we need to address that first, obviously. And you can get kicked out of Google's index. And this is extremely interesting, because even if your content is indexed, again, with some of the updates or without those updates, there are some heuristics, some rules that that help Google kick you out of Google's index. So this is something we're going to dive into as well. Because again, the biggest challenge right now is to get our websites into Google's index, and HTML content included. Today, we're going to get into that quite deep. And this is something I mentioned in the last presentation, that a lot of big brands are not indexed quite a bit, and this is HTML. So whole URL not indexed in Google. So like UX, Menards, Snapdeal, Verizon, Eventbrite, and this list goes on and on. We're going to show you some real examples, some real case studies today, because again, if you create your content and Google cannot find it, it doesn't matter. Like all the other things that we're so excited about in the community, they don't matter that much. Moving forward, if we see that after 2 weeks, quite a lot of JavaScript is not indexed, and this is something I didn't have the time to explain during the last webinar, this is one of the first signs, one of the first problems that we're going to start this vicious cycle of use also struggling with HTML content getting into Google's index. This is something that may sound like a conspiracy in a way, but we'll explain how that works in a second. Because again, JavaScript is more susceptible to indexing issues, but this is slowly changing. So this number was much higher. So a few years back, I wouldn't even imagine that there is going to be a website that's partial indexed, HTML website that's partial indexed. I'm hoping the ambulance is not killing my sound completely, but yeah, these are the times. Anyhow, so this number is decreasing. So JavaScript is not the main offender year over year. It's going down. And again, SEO community is getting excited about those topics, and I couldn't be happier because right now we can look into that and have a clear diagnosis looking at the TGIF database. So we can see, okay, for example, with Google's core update from May, we see clearly that those indexing issues were actually quite large, and we can see Google started to index a little bit more JavaScript content, but the HTML content, so just URL indexing, declined. So those are the things to look into, because if your website is HTML, it may be affected, HTML-based, it may be affected by one of the core updates. So 4 shades of indexing issues, and this is something we want to dive into today. This is not something we explained before, so bear with me. So first of all, URL indexing, the simplest possible way that you can struggle with indexing. Your whole URL is not in Google index. Fairly understandable. You publish your product article, not indexed in Google. And the second flavor of indexing problems, let's call it that, is partial indexing. And you will struggle with partial indexing with mobile first related partial indexing problems, JavaScript related partial indexing problems, and layout or quality based partial indexing problems, the most exciting ones, and something we will dive into. So to begin with URL indexing, this is a very simple case. HTML, I went through their case studies quite a lot of times. I even had a Bartosz's fashion show when I created the whole outfit out of not indexed URLs. So you can see this is a fairly serious problem, because you can see, okay, I'm watching a product that's fully indexable, that's fully indexable by Google, but at the same time, it's not indexing Google. So again, if you want to sell those products, Google won't find them and will struggle with indexing. So yeah, URL indexing, the biggest problem. And if you're a publisher, if you're not an e-commerce, you can struggle with that as well. Let me rewind that to the very beginning. This is an article from Medium by B.H. Bogutsky about, I have no idea what it's about actually, some kind of relationship to technology. Article from 2 years ago. And if we look at that, this URL is again not indexed after 2 years on medium.com, not indexed in Google. And however we check it, if we check a fragment of text, if we check anything from that URL, we'll not find it in Google. Again, URL is indexable, it's not canonicalized, it's not blocked by robots. So this is the first problem, the simplest to diagnose, basically your whole URL not indexed in Google. Moving forward, now we're getting into the partial indexing flavor of indexing problems. So we can have JavaScript related indexing problems. So let me go to the top. This is Walmart.com, some kind of guitar related product. I have no idea what it is. Probably Ziemek from our company would know better. But if we look into one part of that content, so again, let me go to the top, sorry. So this part, so consider these popular products section relies on JavaScript. And now have a look at what's happening when I switch off JavaScript. So I scroll down, I switch JavaScript off, boom, and this part of the content is gone. So because of that, also Google didn't index this section. So consider these popular products is not indexed in Google. Sorry, I struggle with this video. This is a little bit too exciting. So this part of this URL is not, of this product description is not indexing Google because of the JavaScript. But also what they do here, and sorry to show you this video so many times, but also what I've noticed is that there is this section, JavaScript is disabled. Maybe you will see that. JavaScript is disabled, and this website requires JavaScript to function correctly, which is okay. But then if we look at that, they have that indexed 27 million times. So Google is indexing that warning within Walmart.com. So please don't do that. Please make sure that all these JavaScript warnings, that first of all are extremely outdated, but secondly, make sure that Google is not picking those up. So this is an example of partial indexing that's caused by JavaScript. And this is one of the last times that we're going to be mentioning JavaScript now, because we're getting into the partial indexing that's mobile first related. Something I personally am very excited about, very passionate about, because you can see that some of the content within this page, like made in Italy within ux.com, is only visible on desktop. This is causing that content to be skipped by Google when indexing, because Google is using we can assume, mobile crawler for ux.com, and this is causing this very interesting problem with partial indexing based on mobile first. And the last, before we get into diagnostics, the last piece that's actually very exciting as well is quality or layout related indexing problems. So Google actually, for the first time in the history, just recently announced that they will skip parts of your page, parts of your layout, if they see that it's not closely related to your main content. So in this case, from audible.com, so this is part of Amazon, we can see that there is a book description in Spanish on an English website, but at the same time, if we look at the people who bought this also bought section, it's completely HTML, it's visible with JavaScript off, it's visible on both desktop and mobile, but is it related to the main content? Like, this is the biggest problem. This one section is in English when description is in Spanish on an English website. This is quite complex, and I'm not surprised that Google chose, okay, maybe we don't have to index that, maybe it's not that interesting, not that related to the main content of that book description. And this is one of the most difficult problems to diagnose on scale, because it's not going to happen site-wide, it's going to happen based on your pages. Sometimes it's site-wide, but it's not always the case. So how can we troubleshoot that? We actually use Write for that. And we're not. Sorry, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Should.
So if you talk about like the exact same piece of content, like with JavaScript and without JavaScript, so can we say that the same exact content without JavaScript may also have indexing problems? What I mean is does Google choose over which one is less valuable or more valuable based on the fact that it is powered by JavaScript or not?
So this is complex, because I'm guessing that we can have the same problem of content not related to the main content. So part of the layout that's not related to the main content that also relies on JavaScript. So in here, this could be the case. Obviously, this is related to the main content. Oh, sorry, this is mobile first, but with JavaScript. So if we look at this part, so partial indexing for Walmart with the section consider these popular products, I would assume if this was HTML, there is a very, very good chance that if those products, and we can see that they're actually here, they're related, but very often Google will skip those sections. These are the highest risk sections. So this is a very good question, Sevi. So I would start with, first of all, if possible, making them accessible within HTML. But if Google is still going to struggle with indexing those, then you need to rethink if this is really that important part of the product page. In this case, I would also consider, why is it above the product? Why did you put like who? Like, I'm not the UX expert, but why would you put consider these popular products on top of the product? This is a very brave choice, and I'm hoping there is some kind of logic behind that. But yeah, I would first address JavaScript related issues. So Barry is not saying it's evil, but then there's a very good chance that Google will still skip it.
Okay, cool.
That's a very good question, Sevi. I don't want to geek out into too many details, so thanks for keeping an eye on that. So again, if your content is visible with JavaScript switched off or doesn't rely on JavaScript, it's basically the same. Visible on both desktop and mobile, but Google is still not going to pick this up. That means that you most likely have a quality problem, or your layout is structured in a way that Google basically is saving resources, saving disk space to remove that. Okay, troubleshooting that with Write, and again, we're not sponsored by Write, even though we're very open to it, wink wink, Marcus, but we just use it to diagnose those problems because they have those interesting features of comparing mobile crawls to desktop crawls, mobile crawls with JavaScript enabled, disabled. So there are 4 shades of our websites. And I would recommend, even if you're not using Write, which is amazing again, but I would recommend using a cloud-based crawler. So, and again, Screaming Frog is amazing. All those all of those crawlers that you install on your computer, probably there's a better name for that, are amazing, but they don't give you so much data as any of the cloud-based crawlers. So yeah, again, 4 shades of JavaScript. So if you go on your website using your mobile with JavaScript enabled, this is a one view to compare. But then if you switch off JavaScript on your mobile, this is the second point of view on your website. Then we have the same with desktop with JavaScript enabled and disabled. And we need to make sure that all those 4 different views are the same data-wise. Or if we remove something for mobile, it has to be a very, very you need to think about this decision, and you need to understand what are the consequences of that. So this is an example from one of those big brands I showed you before. I don't want to show the brand because this is not the most important part here, but what we can see on the screen is with a mobile crawl, which is actually quite interesting. With a mobile crawl, quite a lot of URLs are indexable, but I think 63,000 URLs are indexable, but 37, so I'm guessing 100,000 crawl URL are duplicate. But the same page will have only 18,000 indexable URLs with a lot of others. So you can see, okay, you're crawling the same website with a mobile versus desktop, and you have so many differences here. But also, you need to make sure that this is with JavaScript or without JavaScript, because we don't know if Google is going to decide to render your content or not. Something we saw with Walmart. I'm guessing for some pages they would still render that JavaScript, but for others they would index that please enable the JavaScript section. So this is all something to look into in depth, because if those 4 website graphs are going to be different, you're going to struggle. And not only look at the indexability, but also make sure to look into unique content, number of words per page, and just to compare those two. Because if you're going to see that you have, on average, let's say 5,000 words per page on a desktop, but then it goes down to 1,000 words per page on a mobile, you will struggle. That's going to show you that, okay, maybe you need to rethink your mobile version a little bit. Maybe you need to somehow find a middle ground, because then you may struggle when you're switched to the mobile crawl, or I'm guessing most of you are already crawled by a mobile user agent. And this is going to lead to a lot of different trends with what we're seeing in our database, because you're going to see that some JavaScript content is going to, like with some of the updates, Google will pick up a little bit more JavaScript content. Sometimes they will decrease. So this is also something to monitor, because if you rely on JavaScript, you need to somehow monitor if your content indexing is not changing over time. Because first of all, it's very difficult to diagnose, because your URLs will be indexed by Google, but some of the content will be kicked out, so you'll lose rankings, and you will go over all these conspiracy theories or problems with your website, when in fact, just Google started to index less JavaScript or less HTML. So you need to somehow monitor that for your domain, either manually or somehow build a tool set for that. Unfortunately, there are no publicly accessible tools for that, so this requires a lot of manual legwork still. And we cannot make our tool accessible for everyone because it requires a lot, again, to manually add every single website. It's a few hours to add a website and then to make sure it works properly. But for now, you need to monitor those trends and see if those trends are not affecting your rankings, your indexing, and your traffic problems. And what we've learned from some, actually few years now of solving those indexing issues, they are, in most cases, we had actually one exception that was widely published in the SEO community. In most cases, they're self-induced and they can be solved. So if your content is not indexed in Google, blaming Google is obviously an amazing solution, but it's not going to help you with anything. So you need to make sure that you understand very closely your crawling, rendering, and indexing problems on scale. So again, we need to take that as technical SEOs and basically try to solve that on our end. So let's look into that. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into index selection today. I never had a chance to do that in depth. So first of all, Google will index less and less content because they clearly said that there is a limit. And if we compare that to a club, Google has limited both disk space, so like a physical space to save our content on a hard drive, but also they will struggle with computing power to render that content. So we have a few different, and then last, or maybe I should start with that, they will have limited resources to crawl their content. So it's gonna, starting from the beginning, they can struggle with, first of all, crawling your content. If your website is not structured in a way that's helping out Google, that's not making it very efficient, then you're gonna have issues with Google accessing your content through crawling. Then they may struggle with rendering your content, and most of our websites rely on scripting, on rendering quite a bit. So if you have a lot of JavaScript, if you have a lot of CSS that's maybe not structured very efficiently, that's going to be a problem for search engines as well. And the last thing, if your content is not of a high quality, Google may choose not to index it. Or maybe if something better comes up, they will kick you out of the index. So going back to our example, there's the limit at Google, and they mentioned that as a disk space being one of the limiting factor. But also, if they have more room, they will allow some less attractive URLs to get into the index. So again, a club comparison. But if some more attractive URLs show up, they may kick you out of that index as well. So this is a very, very simplified point of view on index selection, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in a second. But this whole thing with index selection, this begins after you get rendered. So if your content is not rendered properly, then you're not even standing in that line. That's why you need to make sure you have efficient crawling, information strategy, and so on. So looking at rendering from the search engine's point of view, let me begin with one quick confession. Some of these statements now are actually already confirmed by Martin, which is amazing. So last week, Martin confirmed quite a lot of our research, but this is still an early beginning of this whole topic of rendering SEO, of indexing. So please allow us to basically include more corrections as we have data. So let me start with basics of how browser is looking at our content versus how batch optimized fetch and render architecture is looking at our content. So this is a comparison of how you would see H&M's page in your Chrome versus how batch optimized rendering architecture would look at that. And this is how this is happening step by step. So first of all, and we went through that, Bor is going to skip all of the resources which are not essential to see your content basically. And this is including tracking scripts, ads, and images. And one of the very interesting finding that we actually unraveled yesterday on Twitter is we started wondering, what if all of your scripts are squeezed into one massive JavaScript file? Or all of your CSS is squeezed into one CSS file. And something we should be looking at from development point of view right now, and this is something that we can explain a little bit more today, is you need to make sure that that Google is not getting all of the scripts, all of the logic, all of the CSS that's only user oriented. So if you have this amazing feature that when you click on something, I don't know, there's an explosion, Google is not gonna click. So you shouldn't ship that, you shouldn't send that to Google to render because you're wasting their resources. So it's a good idea to somehow split those scripts so it's very clear for Google which can be ignored because they're only essential for users. Like if you have that wonderful music playing in the background, for example, when I visit the website, I always love it so much when there's a music in the background and I don't know which website it's from. So maybe Google won't listen to that. Maybe don't ship it to Google, but obviously this is a joke. But all of the logic behind like sliding sidebars, Tomek, what's the name of the sliding thing on top? I'm having a stroke.
Sliding bars, carousels?
Carousels, yeah. So for example, JavaScript logic for all the carousels and on all that, it's always it's often very heavy, very difficult to process and render. And in the end, Google doesn't need that. Google won't be scrolling through your product carousel. So you need to go through all of the scripts, all of the features within your website, and think maybe if I'm struggling with indexing my content, I don't need to ship it to Google. Maybe Googlebot doesn't need to get that, or maybe I can extract that into a separate script and Google hopefully will figure out that this is not essential. You can then have a look into that in your server logs. Moving forward, Google is also not looking at images, they look at mock images, and there are some consequences of that. We'll get into that in a second. So you can emulate that view that we just saw in your Chrome browser. So remove all of the scripts that are not crucial, remove all of the images, and see and have a look at all the how it's going to affect your website. So first of all, you shouldn't see any layout shifts. So if you remove images, if you remove some of the scripts that are not essential for your layout, and you see some kind of layout shift, it's also going to be affecting your rendering and indexing because Google is going to struggle to see your full layout. This is something that happened for this page as well. Maybe you saw that, but we'll get to that in a second. And removing all of those scripts is quite important that Google does that because it's saving quite a lot of resources. So if you look at that, just removing all of those ads, all of those images, saved a lot of time scripting. So if you look at scripting, one of the most expensive part for Google to, as we see that scripting seems to be of a higher risk than rendering because Google is trying to avoid that scripting time. So they remove all of those resources to save their computing power. But the second thing they're going to do is they're going to set the value of a virtual clock. And Martin Split from Google was nice enough to confirm that they actually have that virtual clock that is extremely complex. But what we need to know about the virtual clock is that basically virtual clock is the only metric that Google is using to measure the computing power needed to render your content, regardless of if you have a JavaScript or not. It's just very, very important. Moving forward, when the virtual clock's time runs out, the website's layout is generated. And this is extremely complex now. As Martin said, it's devilish? Like it's very, very complex. I don't remember the exact phrase he used because if you're gonna run out of that virtual clock to render your content, Google is gonna have to make a decision of which content to basically remove from your page to squeeze within those resources. Okay. So we can use this data to rank a little bit better. Just give me 1 second because I think there is a little bit of noise in my background. Anyhow, we can use this data to rank better because first of all, you need to understand two main concepts. So one is virtual clock and second is layout. And as I explained before, virtual clock is a form of rendering budget. And even though Googlers don't really like us using that term because they say there is no such thing as rendering budget, virtual clock is the only thing limiting us like using a little bit too much of JavaScript, CSS, or shipping extremely heavy, difficult to render websites. So if you look into a virtual clock, again, it's measuring the cost of our rendering. And it does it by just pausing all of these, pausing the virtual clock while waiting for scripts, CSS files. So if Google is going to execute a script that's going to ask for more resources, for example, I'm going to ask a new image to be fetched or a new CSS file to be fetched, the virtual clock is going to pause and it's going to resume once all of those files are ready to render. So we don't need to worry about fetch times, timeouts, and this hopefully is going to end one huge discussion that we had about timeouts with JavaScript. It doesn't matter that much how much time it takes to fetch from obviously the virtual clock's point of view. And again, heavy websites heavy on CSS, websites heavy on JavaScript, they need more time on that virtual clock. They won't get that time, but they need more of that time on the virtual clock. So just to simplify that, a batch optimized render and fetch architecture is a place where real time doesn't matter. The only thing we're worried about right now is computing power. Obviously, this is just for batch optimized render and fetch architecture. So important things, it measures time spent on actual rendering, but not only rendering, this is a simplification, scripting, everything that's requiring computing power to process your code. That's why we mentioned scripting. This is not something we confirmed with Googlers, but we're seeing that websites that require a lot of scripting, they struggle with indexing a little bit more than ones that require the same amount of rendering time. But again, this may be just a correlation. Not important for virtual clock fetch timeouts, waiting for stuff that's requested from your server, time to fetch resources, waiting for more things, and artificial delays. So they don't look into animations, fade of images, so all that. So there is really no need even to ship it to Google if you can structure your code in a way that's pushing those animations, those interactions into a separate JavaScript file. And hopefully Google won't pick this up. So when the virtual clock's time runs out, we are running into this extremely complex situation because the layout is generated. And the layout is generated regardless of if it's finished or not. So depending on how your code is structured, you may see that your content is just partially indexed.
Okay, so about the layout, can we say that, for example, the content placement or the layout in general is at least as important as the content itself in this case? Because I remember Martin saying last week that they semantically understand where the main content of the page is, or which part of the content is more important or less important according to where they are placed on the page. So what I mean is the quality of the content, as we always say, or as everybody knows, is very, very, very important. But the layout or how we place the content on the page is at least as important in this case.
I'm trying to answer this question without creating more confusion,
Okay.
because this is not easy. First of all, the placement is one, but let's use the same example I think we used last week with Martin. So one thing, and again, I promise Martin that we're gonna do everything in our power to avoid more confusion, because then he's gonna have to clean up our mess.
Yeah.
So let's imagine that you have a product page selling running shoes, and you have similar products below. It's all HTML. Similar products below, and in those similar products you have barbecues, you have like guitars, you have all the other products from, let's say, Walmart. It's just a random example. Google will most likely skip that part because they say, okay, this page is about A, so running shoes, and those other sections are not really something we need as a signal to rank this page better. So why would they spend resources? Why would they keep it in Google's index like forever? And this is why partial indexing is so complex, because it's not really about only JavaScript or only the layout. It's about understanding how layout and how resources and how Google's understanding of your layout is gonna affect that. We're going to get into different sections of the website in a second, but we need to understand that right now, for the first time in history, if we have a page about something, it has to be about that one topic. We cannot be trying to push the crawler budget into different sections of the page. We cannot be trying to the page rank sculpting or whatever people are still believing in when we have a product page with running shoes and we want to index all of those new products from, I don't know, outdoor or barbecue, whatever sections. This is not going to work anymore. And we see that in the wild that actually Google is very, very good at that. So those things are not going to fly anymore. And going back to this topic of the limit of computing resources, we, before diagnosing if this is a quality issue or a layout issue, we need to understand if our website is extremely resource hungry. Because even though, and again, I'm going to repeat that Martin said that there is no such thing as a rendering budget, he admitted that there is such thing as a virtual clock. And we would be extremely naive as technical SEOs, thinking that if we ship 20 seconds worth of rendering and scripting to Google, they will index that. We see that this is not happening. We have clear data that if you have too much scripting, if your website is extremely inefficient, you can compare that to that gas guzzler car that's extremely not economical. We need to make sure that our cars are like, our websites are like Prius or Teslas are extremely economical. Because Google is overwhelmed with rendering, so they have to save those resources. So if we see like this example, this is actually H&M, the page we did. We saw a second ago a listing or a category page of jeans. We see slowing down a fast CPU just 6 times. So this is an average mobile device in some of the countries in Europe. Google will have to spend 10 seconds rendering, and actually you blurred that part, and 9 seconds scripting. So it's 18 seconds of heavy computing power, or just, let's say, mid-level computing power, just to see your content. Not to mention they have to crawl it, they have to get to that content. So they crawled thousands of pages to find some valuable pages within your structure, and then they have to spend 20 seconds just seeing what's within that page. So you can imagine yourself that even if we're comparing that to human, no one is that patient, and Google is not that patient as well, because it's really, really expensive. And we have 2 options to actually, we have hundreds of options, but we're going to go through 2 options of measuring that virtual clock's load. And again, one of these is our toolset. So TLDR, too long didn't render. It's going to give you a score from 0 to 100. If you're anywhere above 20, you should look into that a little bit closer. And again, this is a tool that's going to give you a very simple result. It's by no means binding. So make sure that if you have a high score, worry. But if your score is low, I wouldn't worry about that, because because it's not gonna, you know what I mean. So low score means that you're fine, but anything above 20, just look into that a little bit closer. It may be a false negative. Simulate bore in your Chrome developers tool. So this is a little bit more precise, because you have a very good control over which resources are not needed to Google. Something we cannot do within our toolset. So we can remove all of the scripts that don't change the layout. You can remove all of the CSS files that are maybe not important for that page, if this is possible, but then you shouldn't keep them there anyways. But yeah, then you can remove all of the images, all of the ads, all of the tracking scripts, analytics, hotjars, whatever you have, anything that's not needed by Google, and then you can play with that in your Chrome. And this is how where we leave the JavaScript SEO world, and we're gonna enter the rendering SEO world. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into what Sevi asked about. So in 2011, and this is our theory, this is what we see from Google's documentation, Google got a little bit more interested in layout. So before 2011, and again, this is our assumption, Google was even rendering content in a very simplified way, or they didn't render it at all. They were just extracting content from the code. Again, this was possible in 2011. Now with the rise of new frameworks in JavaScript, it's not. So 2011 also happens to be a date when Google Panda was released, and a lot of content quality updates. as we see that from, again, Google patents and the documentation that was published, this was the year where Google really started to look into layout, into how the content is structured, into where the content is within the page. And I remember those Google times of 2010 when you can have 10 million low quality pages within one website and it would rank like crazy. People would just scan old books or whatever just to push some content to Google. It worked very well. It ended with Panda, and there are some new findings about layout and rendering. Let's go through that. So first of all the rendering patterns, all the crawling patterns, all of the indexing patterns we found, they all put the most focus on layout, something that we didn't appreciate enough as technical SEOs. And we knew some of these parts, like the content location was important. So above the fold is more important. Above the fold is more important than below the fold, which was quite obvious. But then if we look into that, you have to look into. Oh, we have a question about. Should we take the question now? Maybe a quick pause about shipping different parts of content to Google. So we have a question. Can you elaborate more on how you don't need to ship everything to Google? Block certain files with robots or something else? Oh, yeah, it magically showed up on the screen. Thank you, Ziemek. So this is a very good question. And there's my conversation with Martin Split about that yesterday. And then Barry Schwartz wrote a quick article based on that Twitter exchange yesterday as well. Maybe we can include that in the chat somewhere if you can find it, Ziemek, or you maybe Tomek. And let me elaborate on that a little bit more. Before I do that, let me. Okay, so this is a very, very exciting topic. So first of all, we have two schools. So first of all, some websites will have one enormous, let's say, JavaScript or CSS file, and they will ship that file to everyone visiting. Is it Googlebot? Is it a user? Doesn't matter. Like one huge JavaScript file for everyone. And basically then a search engine needs to process this whole thing with a lot of user-facing logic and a lot of Google-facing logic or search engine-facing logic just to see the content. So they waste quite a lot of resources not needed to see your content. And I wouldn't block those resources in robots, but if you can, if that's possible, I was just playing with a theory looking at our data. If you have one script that's just responsible for your main crucial content, for your basic layout, and it's very lightweight. So you have one script without all of this logic for pop-ups, for menus, for everything. Google will most likely pick this up, and you can have, let's say, guaranteed rendering and indexing. So keep your main content extremely lightweight, including all of the product carousels and everything. You don't need to include that logic in that file. And all of the logic that's basically scrolling through carousels, that's those wonderful animation when I click on a menu. Google doesn't need that, so keep it in a separate file. And again, I wouldn't block Google from visiting those files, but at the same time, I don't think it would harm you. But in general, Google is smart enough right now that they will most likely skip that file. You can see that in server logs. If you're gonna see that Google is for some reason requesting that file quite a bit, you can play with just blocking it and so on. If your developers are a little bit more advanced and they understand critical rendering path and they understand web performance quite a bit, you can have that one huge file. But search engines, you can structure this one huge script or CSS in a way that only that Google won't execute those user-facing logic. And I won't dive into that. This is a very, very new idea. This is something that's possible from code perspective, but this is quite complex. But anyhow, try to make sure that your critical content, so your content that's within the viewport, and it's in a separate, very, very lightweight file. It doesn't require 4 seconds of rendering or 4 seconds of scripting. It shouldn't take that long just to see your main content. But yeah, we'll get into that in a second. Thank you for that question. We can, if you have follow-up questions, we can dive into that in the Q&A section. But just to finish this up, looking at this section, we have 700 milliseconds or 1 second of scripting and rendering just to see the main content of H&M on a very, very fast computer. So I don't think this is how much you need just to see content without images and without any logic like scrolling or whatever. Moving forward, we ended up here saying about the layout. So this is also something that if some sections, like I'm mentioning this part of the layout because Google started to look into layout in 2011, but what we see in TGIF, what we see from our toolset is they're applying the same logic that they applied to understanding which content is important to crawl, to index, to which links are more important within the page. They're applying the same logic because, again, it makes sense to pick which content should be indexed or not. So we can look into these documents, we can look into those findings, and we can assume if one section of content is more important to Google, that there is a higher chance that they will index that. But we'll get into that in a second. So first of all, they will crawl some URLs within your page more eagerly or more. There is a better chance that your URLs that are within your main content or your most popular article section or something like that, there is a higher chance that Google will crawl these. Then you may also be interested in some random URLs that have nothing to do with the main content. So prominence of that section within the rendered layout, so they need to understand your layout, is important. We'll get into that in a second. So few sections that they talk about in Google's documentation, again, is above default or some kind of main content, is below default or some kind of boilerplate content, so your navigation or sidebars or whatever. This is definitely less important. So if you want to make sure that your website is crawled, don't rely on putting your links just in a footer or in your navigation somewhere or in your sidebar somewhere and so on. And the worst place to be at, according to Google, is ads. So they're very good to spot like sponsored content or anything like that. And the definition of what ad is, when we look at TGIF, is very broad. So maybe you're pushing clients from one product, again, from those running shoes to barbecues. We could speculate that Google may look at that section as an ad because it doesn't bring value to users. So that's why they may skip it. But this is a wild speculation from our end. Moving forward, we can see that right now it changed from just seeing the content as what we were focusing with JavaScript SEO, but we would look at now at which sections of your content are more important. And we can see that because if we see that Google is skipping one part of the layout, it's not indexing one part of the layout, there's a very, very high chance, extremely high chance that this is a section that needs work on your end. And again, Google has a lot of data from clicks from Chrome. This is, again, very, very well documented. I think, Tomek, do you wanna elaborate on how Google is also gathering user data and comparing that with the rendered layout?
Oh, wild speculations. Maybe another webinar. But that's a long story because, like, in many cases, I was reading Google patents, and there was like things like click-through rates, etc. It's topic for another webinar or another article. Like,
so yeah, without any wild speculations, something we have to focus on is if. First of all, Google is gathering some data about our website. We know that there is a Chrome user experience report with web performance. They know which element is crucial for our critical rendering path and so on. So one thing to look into, and this is our theory, again, this is not directly stated, like confirmed by Google. It's in the patents, it's something we see. We need a little bit more confirmation, is if your layout that Google rendered for your website is shifted, it's basically somehow broken, we see and we believe that Google may struggle to connect those these two data sets. So if they have a lot of data on how users are clicking, interacting with your websites, how it's loading, what's the web performance, but then the website they see in the batch optimized rendering engine is completely different because, for example, your image crashed or some of the scripts didn't load fully, then you may struggle. This is something we looked into. We had one case study where we actually are pretty sure that this is the problem, because after fixing that, rankings improved. But again, this requires a lot more research. Speaking of images and crashing layout, Google is rendering using mock images. So they not look at your real images when rendering. So rendering engine doesn't care about your images at all. They don't fetch them. They only look at your image, the image dimensions, and based on those image dimensions, they create a mock image. To explain what mock image is, it's an empty square or a rectangle to be exact, without any data. So they only put those as a placeholder just to see your layout. So if one of your images is gonna return a 404 and you don't have image dimensions hard-coded within your website, or it's not in a div, there are hundreds of different ways to do that. Again, looking at that one example, and this is a random example from H&M, this is not major still. Look at that. Just because we removed the image, the whole layout shifted quite a bit. Let me show you. So first of all, cache your images, boilerplate ones especially, boilerplate images, or images that are showing up for every single page within your domain. Make sure that those are cached, that Google is accessing those, and don't change those images name, or don't refresh those images with deploys if you don't have to. This is something, again, that Martin said, that a lot of developers are refreshing cache without a clear reason for that. So if the image didn't change, don't refresh that file name, or don't push search engines to cache it again. So that's one, and it's extremely important because it's going to give you a lot of new crawler budget. It's going to help with your indexing and rendering. Then step number two, or second thing to watch for, closely monitor 404s, because if you don't have image dimensions in your code, or they're not nested in a div, or again, there are numbers of solutions for that, single image crashing or returning a 404 and looking at server logs, or if you have Search Console added for your subdomain serving your images, and I'm guessing that within the people watching this webinar, if you now start looking to your Search Console, you only have your main domain, so you have www.onely.com, but you maybe don't have cdn.cloudflare. whatever. So make sure to monitor those, because one image returning a 404 may crash your layout. And you can see here that for H&M, just logo, just a very small, simple image shifted the whole layout up by, I would say, 100 pixels at least. And larger images will cause your whole layout to crash. So this is extremely fun to, this is fun to see what's happening. It's probably not very fun to see what's happening with your traffic with that, but make sure to monitor those images. Moving forward with different placements, the value of links depends on their location attributes. And I'm not talking about external links. This is also the case, but I'm talking about internal links. So if you want to optimize your internal linking, and you have one of those wonderful link clouds in the bottom of your page, and you want Google to scroll these to improve your crawler budget, those things, they worked well in the past. I would assume if you still see them working somewhere, don't hold on to that as a solution. So position of the link within the page, is it in a list? Is it in running text? Above or below the screen fold, this all will affect your crawler budget. So the more important the link is, the more eagerly Google is going to crawl that. So having all of those sections of similar products, people who bought this also, or most popular pages or most popular articles, Google will very, very often, if they see that this is not relevant to a given page, they will skip that altogether for both crawling and indexing and rendering. So the value of links and the layout is more and more important than ever. And footer versus sidebar, again, Google knows now how people click within your page. So if you stuff something just for Google, I think these times are getting to an end when this worked. So just to show you an exact quote, an exact example, which doesn't happen that often in patents. So for example here, if we're looking at the top stories page, just to make sure that this is a top stories page or a main page, then more top stories is a good place to be at. But if someone is reading an article about a very specific problem, then the section more top stories is not relevant to that section anymore. Maybe someone was only looking at the stock price of, I don't know, IBM, and then the more top stories section is not something he's interested in because he didn't look for more top stories. He was just interested in that one thing. So looking at CNN.com, so again, the homepage, more top stories is a very good place to be because you're looking at top stories. And again, if you're looking at the product page with shoes, having more top products from the page is a completely ridiculous thing to place that within your layout. So I'm guessing this is more of a, it was more of a UX problem. Now it became a technical SEO problem because Google will keep indexing that section with HTML pages, and we'll get into more case studies, more examples in a second. Link location and link attributes matter. I won't get into that too deep. Basically, make sure that your crucial links, your crucial pages are linked somewhere within the main content, and it's done naturally, so it's within the context. If you're into link building, if you're into anything like that, text in advertisements, so if you're still doing that, buying those links in sidebars or places like that on blogs or whatever, Google knows this is an advertisement, even if it's a do follow link from PageRank 8 page, sorry, if you still, or domain authority, whatever. Like, make sure that the links going to your page are also very related to the main content, hopefully within the main content and related to the main topic of the page. But this is a topic for a whole other presentation. And content prominence, this is really, really important. If you have the main section, like Google knows that I visited this page to visit this main section of the content. If your content is linked there, or yeah, we'll get into that as well, but Google will index your main content, even if it's heavily scripted, even if it requires a lot of rendering. So your main content is the king. Google will spend more resources on that. So the content prominence is really, really important. And again, above the fold versus below the fold is not as important as if this is the main content, this is within the topic. Content change rates are also playing a quite an important part. So this is something to look into. If you change just a tiny bit of your website, but this is not prominent, there is a smaller chance that Google will recrawl and re-index that page. But if you change your main content, there is a very good chance that Google will recrawl and re-index that page. So you will see that, and you can experiment at home. Something we did recently with Tomek, and we were very angry that it didn't work. We changed a tiny bit of our article. We added some links for an experiment's sake, and Google didn't pick it up. We had to either add it in a new article or change a larger section of the content. Small changes won't trigger, so just small change rates won't, or small changes would trigger recrawl and re-index or re-render of your content.
So here, what about the content that changes more frequently than the other side of the page? How are they affected by crawling?
Can you elaborate? I didn't know. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean the content which changes more frequently on the page, like news or things like that, versus the content that stays more like the same.
So if you have a news page, let's say a home page or a category page of a news website, and if the main content, again, top stories, is changing, you can see that this is a very prominent section for Googlebot. So one tiny change or a new link there will be quickly picked up by Google because they know that this is a very prominent, important place that people look at that actually drives traffic. At the same time, if within the same page, you will have like related items or something that's not really related to top stories, something that is not crucial, something that heuristics will see as not the most prominent section within that homepage of, I'm struggling to find an example, but let's say that, I don't know, promoted articles, whatever, something that's not that important for users, Google most likely won't recrawl, re-render and re-index that, basically to save resources, because they see, okay, this is not worth it So with all the changes within our content, we need to ask ourselves the question, is it really worth for Google to spend resources just to see that one extra link? There's a very good chance that they won't do that. But
Okay.
so ad placement is something that's going to affect your indexing. So for example, if you have a page that's filled with ads and there's just a tiny bit of content, there's a very good chance that Google won't index that at all. So ratio of those ads to content, maybe Google will try to index that one page, but if you're, and again, we're coming back to the example from before, if your main content is nested within the same script, or it requires the same computing power, just you have to process all of the ads, all of the extra content just to see that main content, and there is no way for Google to extract that one section, there is a very good chance that this whole URL is not going to be indexed. Because again, this is a very simple decision for the algorithm. Is it worth the resources? If they see, okay, there are not too many visits to this page, if there is no, I'm assuming, search value, or this is not the best content within that topic, there is a very good chance that they will just skip it altogether. So moving forward, link placement, user behaviors on site, which links get clicked, these sections will have a higher probability of being indexed. And for the first time, we have more data, and we have data about how Google renders stuff. So looking into TLDR, looking into 1 year of our findings, we can see, okay, some sections are not that, not indexed that happily by Google, but I think this is a good moment for some of the real life examples. So maybe I'm gonna, Ziemek, if I could share my different screen. I'll do that right now. So let's have a quick pause because I'm worried that we're we're pushing too much data. So, okay. So we have a few examples of pages, HTML pages struggling with indexing. And this one is from Barnes & Noble. This is, I'm guessing, a book from Barnes & Noble. And I know that explore more items element is not indexed. So this one. And I'm looking at this page with JavaScript switched off. Let me zoom it a bit. So I hope everyone sees that properly. So we can see, okay, this is a page from, again, a large store, Barnes & Noble. The URL is indexed, just to show you a real-life example of how this may work. So we can see that the URL is indexed, and it works fine. The content where I know that it's not indexed actually, so this one, this section is not relying on JavaScript. So let's check it as well. So yeah, this doesn't rely on JavaScript, and we can even check if this relies on mobile first or not. Boom, we change that to a mobile user agent. We can see, okay, this explore more items section is available with a mobile user agent as well. So just to refresh that, if we look at this section, explore more items, that's again HTML accessible for all the user agents. And if we see if this section is indexed within this page, we'll see, we'll see that it's not. So there are no results. So this is the first step. So if we see something like that for this page, and I'm sorry, but my German is not very good, or not good at all. We can see that, okay, this page, this book, maybe this section is not something that's really valuable for the users. Maybe it's something that we should remove altogether. Maybe other sections within that page struggle. But we can see also that related searches here, that Barnes & Noble is trying to push a little bit of the crawler budget using this whole section, and Google is ignoring that altogether. So we can see, again, Google is a little bit smarter than we thought they are. And if we try to fix our crawler budget issues by just putting a lot of internal links within the page, they may skip it altogether, especially if we have different languages here mixed up and different different problems with that content. So just to show you a few examples, there's one more just before we go back. Oh, this was actually in the video. So audible.com. If we have two different languages mixed, if we have two different, if we have something that's kind of difficult for search engines to follow. So we have Spanish here, but it's an English website with English reviews, but all the other content is English. We'll see that Google will skip some of the pages, some of the elements. So here is people also bought. So this section is gonna be completely skipped by Google. And this section is not skipped within all of the pages within audible.com. So we can see, okay, this is something that may be a problem for this specific page. This is something to look into when diagnosing partial indexing, when diagnosing all of the problems. So that's just to show you one example of what may happen, of how to basically put that to use for your website. So again, Google will, sorry, Jemek, if you could add my screen with a presentation back in. Yeah, so we can see that Google will index some of your main content, but if your extra content is not related to the main page, or maybe it's very expensive to render, they will happily, so Google will happily skip it. And you think JS is the most problematic one, and again, we'll see that HTML content will often be the one that's skipped for quite a lot of pages. This is Overstock, this is UX. Google will skip HTML content when it's not really related to that. And it also, like going back to CPU consumption, Google will interrupt scripts. So after we have our content relevant, we have quality content, we need to look into our computing power, how much scripts that search engine needs to, scripting search engine needs to render our content. The main struggle is computing power. This is one of the quotes from 2012, where Google was using an example of 300 million pages per day, something that seems extremely small as a number. I'm guessing that the guys that write crawl more per hour than that. So we need to understand that Google's computing power is not as huge, and even though it's growing, it's never going to grow as quickly as our website's hunger for scripting and rendering. And also rendering, if your website has to go through, and I'm guessing here that this is JavaScript rendering, because this presentation from Google didn't explain if it's JavaScript rendering or HTML rendering, because they render both. But we can assume that JavaScript rendering takes 20 times more resources. So we need to look into why do we need to render, why do we structure our code like that. And going back to this vicious cycle I was mentioning in the very beginning. So if Google will choose to index your main content first, but they ignore different parts of your layout for the reasons of mobile first being different than desktop, for reasons of JavaScript, or for reasons of just quality of how your layout is structured, they will crawl you less because they won't find all of the links. You will end up with a very confusing website graph because you don't know which links are visited by Google and which are not, which is gonna lead to you struggling with indexing your HTML and indexing your parts of your website. So this is, I think this is where we can wrap this up right now. So and move into the Q&A because I think this is this has been a very, very long presentation. Anyways, but I have one more section. Sorry, we have one more section about the web performance, and we can wrap this up because I see that we are we're taking quite a lot of time today. So one more thing to look into, that, and this is new. This is something we didn't publish before, about crawling selection. So with crawling selection, the faster your website is, the more forgiving Google might be to your website's quality. And this is based on one of the patterns. So if Google has, let's say, 10 seconds, and if your website is very, very fast, they will go over, let's say, 15 URLs. But if your website's response time, or how you serve your scripts, and what's your time to first byte, all of those metrics that are actually required for Google to fetch and crawl your content are a little bit slower, they will be a little bit less forgiving and the quality of your content is going to be higher, so you need more bait to get Google to crawl your content. But if your website is slow, they will crawl just let's assume 30% or even more of the content that they would crawl if that website was a little bit faster. So this is directly visualized based on one of the Google patents, but also every single URL will have a crawling priority. And we can assume that this priority is given based on content placement, based on when that link was found, and so on. So this is also something that we have to look into very, very closely, because URLs below a certain or specific threshold won't be crawled at all. So this is also something to look at. So if, and again, you need to look into your URLs, because if you have a lot of high quality URLs within your queue, and for example, your website is slow, or even if this is not the case, Google will skip lower quality URLs and focus on those of a higher quality. So if Google is not visiting some URLs within your domain, make sure that those are maybe not of low quality. And some key takeaways, I think this is something we can skip and go into Q&A, because it's been quite a long time, and I'm guessing we can go over some of the questions. Okay, so the screenshots taken Google Search Console when evaluating a page seems to not take CSS into account unless the link path to the sales is absolute. Is there any insight about the resources not loaded? So, Johan, the first question I would ask, the first thing I would look into is if your CSS files are served from your main domain, because most likely for a lot of big brands, you have a different subdomain, a different like CDN domain or whatever serving that CSS. So maybe this is the case. Maybe those CSS files are served from, I don't know, HTTP, or maybe there is a different version of your domain, either a subdomain or something is different. So then Search Console will often not show that. I'm not sure if this is 100% what you meant. If not, then I'll clarify. Oh, hello, Angelina. Nice to see you again. Partially, how have you explained the need to correct this product to product engineers, or tips for measuring the business impact? Okay, so usually what we start with, and this is difficult for a lot of clients, what we start with is we look at general indexing statistics of a domain. And I'm wondering, because you cannot see that anywhere else but within the toolset that we were building for a few months. But in general, I would look into, if you want to do that without any specific tools, if they deploy, if developers or if a new sitemap is deployed with new URLs, you can manually check every 1-2 hours, just a random sample of these, how soon they're getting indexed. So the simplest thing, this is something we've been doing, I think, even in 2013-14, we had a listing website where all the new listings, they wouldn't be indexed for a few days, few weeks sometimes, and competitors would have listings with the same topic that would get picked up. We were basically randomly, manually checking different pages and see, okay, how quickly Google is picking those up. And if you tell your product people, your engineers, your developers that they can produce as much content as possible, but Google is not picking this up, this usually is going to open the doors, because they can clearly see that whatever they do, Google is not seeing that. This works very well. So just the latest URLs from the sitemap, if they have a good sitemap, which is a whole other problem, and then just randomly check like after 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and see if those are getting picked up.
Well, adding to that, from my experience, I believe that page speed, for example, you just talked about it, Page speed is tightly related to rendering JS-heavy pages as well, right? But from the other side, we also see that developers injecting more and more JavaScript into the content. So in this case, it's also important that we need to be on the same page with the developers, not only with product owners or engineers, or also with the developers, because as SEOs, we on daily basis, we cooperate with developers mostly. So they are also the key point here, because you get my point, right? So I believe first we need to make sure that everybody's aware of this serious issue.
And just what you said, Sevi, is when you tell a dev team or a CTO that Google is struggling to render and index the content because of how the code is structured, this is it. First of all, it's a touchy topic because you're criticizing their code, but at the same time, if you give them a clear info, okay, we need to fix it, we need to make sure that this scripting time goes down or whatever, and you give them a benchmark, okay, Google is not picking up this section of the page for web performance reasons, or by how this is a very, first of all, very touchy problem, but they have a lot of motivation fixing that, and you will have more success with this problem than things like crawler budget or things that they don't really see or understand as much as basically you screwed up with shipping heavy code. Let's do something about that.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is difficult. If you want to check a large amount of URLs, you don't have the tools that we have, there are a few tools that can make it happen. Those tools, they come from the old Black Hat SEO days. So you can use Scrapebox, something I still use sometimes just to quickly see how many URLs are indexed or not. So Scrapebox, I think it's $67. It was like that for years. And you buy some proxies, buy like 10, 20 private proxies that are Google enabled. Oh my God, I feel like I'm back in 2012. But anyhow, use things like Scrapebox. Xrammer was doing that. I didn't use it for years, but if I want to do something on the spot, just to wrap this up, I use Scrapebox. So a very, very old Black Hat tool, but it's very good with large list of links. You can duplicate that. You can check indexing. If you have proxies, you can check thousands of URLs and just make sure like the proxies are the most difficult part, because Google is really filtering out a lot of scraping, a lot of automated actions to search engines. But yeah, I would go with Scrapebox and proxies. Yeah.
Even I was trying to check on my own, like a real user, and after a couple of check-in, I got a lot of captchas, and I still can remember all these buses. Mountains.
You can find the crosswalk on any picture now, I guess. So we all had those captchas. So proxies, you can have services solving those captchas. So there are basically companies that will outsource those captchas to real people in India who solve them. But again, I would just go with Scrapebox and just buy, I don't know, 10, 100. Like it's usually a good price range of €1 per proxy. Again, I didn't buy those for a while, but that's how I remember it. Oh, sorry for these good old times. Page speed debugging and optimization. That's really cool question, Christine. And we want to have a webinar in the topic of critical rendering path. And something we're looking at right now is how to address those problems we're talking about from development point of view. So how to structure your code in a way that you're not shipping everything to search engines and maybe some of the things only to users. So we'll definitely address that. Web performance is something we're very, very passionate about. Harry, thank you for your questions. If you think, I love your profile picture. I'm guessing it's also from good old times of SEO and penguins. If using similar product section to help Google discover more product pages, this is the only JS content on the page. Are your findings that due to partial indexing, these won't be crawled as often? Yes. So the simple question is yes. I wouldn't use the similar product section as a solution to crawling at all, and especially if you have a part of your web page, if you hear that, I probably know what I mean, and I don't want to offend anyone, but if developers create one section that relies on JavaScript to help Google crawl something, I wonder where's the logic in that, because you have something that's very difficult, very high cost to render, requires super, like, a lot of computing resources, makes SEO's work much more difficult, and I'm guessing Barry Adams will agree with me that in this case JavaScript is evil, and I wouldn't use JavaScript for similar products, and I wouldn't use similar products for crawling optimization. So there are a lot of problems in this approach, I guess, but in general, yeah. Even with HTML, Google will most likely skip similar products if they're not closely related to your main product. Barry, like, you see that HTML is the same problem. I'm sorry, just to answer Barry's question. You can see that HTML is also something that drives the same problems. You can see that websites like Yux with 19% of URLs in index HTML URLs, HTML content. So yeah, this is we're just joking around, but in general, I think this is all way beyond JavaScript. I think that Google is getting much better with JavaScript, but because of that, they have to save resources and index less of the poor content in general. So I think in this way, Barry is right. JavaScript is evil because it caused all of these extra problems. Oh my God, I'm gonna be quoted on that. Let's move on. Okay, so I think we have no more questions. We still took quite a lot of. Oh, we have one more. Let's do that. So Johan, thank you for your question. In what? Sorry.
Basically, somebody asked a question for Martin Schmidt on Twitter. And at the first thread, he said that he's not sure about that and he will be checking. We'll look for that tweet right now and see it. I guess we can move to another question, then we can go back and let me check.
Tomek is our encyclopedia of Martin's and John's tweets. I have no idea how he remembers all these. But the one more topic, Johan, the second and the waves of rendering, I'm not really sure if this is the case that much anymore. Tomek, maybe you can elaborate on different waves of rendering. If we're not seeing those waves of rendering that much, just to elaborate on it a little bit more. So back when we created our toolset last year, we saw that some JavaScript content wouldn't be picked up, let's say after 24 hours, but then Google would pick up that JavaScript content after a week or two. We're not seeing that much of the difference anymore. So from what we see right now, it's either Google will pick up the JavaScript straight up or they won't anymore. So we're not seeing those two waves no more. And I would assume that Google is either rendering straight up or skipping, Google is either JavaScript rendering straight up or skipping JavaScript altogether. Don't know if you agree on that, Tomek.
Yes, I've posted that link to the tweet on our chat.
Oh, okay. So we have, so I think that Johan's question is answered by Martin. So we can go over that. But just Tomek, I wanted to ask you, do you still see two waves of rendering happening within the toolset, within the database?
Basically, with quite a lot of websites, still there is a JavaScript indexing delay. So the page is indexed, but then we need to wait till the JavaScript content will be indexed. But generally speaking, most of websites are indexed HTML content and JavaScript within minutes or hours. Basically, right now it's okay. It was explained by Martin Schmidt many times that they don't want to index HTML if they don't render the page. So you cannot see, okay, now this is the first part, this is the first wave, it's indexed, then there is another wave, and Google needs to wait for that. You don't see that, and you see, okay, this is like the smooth process, like that.
So as I said, we're slowly seeing that Google is killing two waves. Just I'm guessing this also requires more resources for them to render HTML and then render JavaScript and somehow merge those two all together or replace the first version. So there are still two waves sometimes, but in my opinion, and I don't know, again, Tomek, if you agree on that, it's not happening as often anymore. We see in most cases Google will either crawl and render with JavaScript straight up, or skip rendering with JavaScript like forever.
Yes, as I was talking with Martin Schmidt, they wait for rendering to index a page. So they don't simply put, okay, the initial part in the index, then they don't do it incrementally.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm sorry if we geeked out into some of the topics a little bit more, too much. I hope this was still very valuable for you. We could probably go on and on about some of the cases for quite a bit. This is the last format within this research that we're going to be having. So I think this topic is exhausted. Now we're going to be hopefully hosting Martin again once we finish writing down and collecting all of the content in a written form. We're going to try to have Martin again to address some of the new questions, because the new questions come up quite often, and we're going to ask him to address those in depth in a few weeks. Okay, thank you so much. Sevi, Tomek, do you have anything to add?
No, I just would like to say thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We really appreciate you being here, and I guess we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.